let's go ahead and bring the February 3rd, 2016 Energy and Environment Committee to order. Colleagues, unless there's, I don't see any cards, Madam Clerk, so far, specifically in items 3 through 7. Any cards there?
No, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Colleagues, if it's okay with you, well, let's go ahead and take items 3 through 7 on consent.
No objection.
All right, no objection. That shall be the order. So if you're here for items 3 through 7, they've been deemed approved. So let's go ahead and take item number 1, Mr. Prieto.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Item number 1 relates to the Department of Water and Power report in response to motion Fuentes Blumenfield relative to the status of each of the 10 recommendations from the independent third-party review.
Very good. And as staff is coming up with their presentation on item number 1, colleagues, the theme, as it were, for this committee is to get a little bit of history on what this council has done, or previous councils rather, has done with respect to rates. In 2012, it was recommended that 10 action items be contemplated, investigated, looked at by the department before the next rate case, and that's what this item deals with. So with that, welcome DWP.
Council members, I'm Jeff Peltola, Chief Financial Officer for LADWP. With me I have Neil Guglielmo, who is Head of Rates, Budget and Financial Planning. We also have Richard Tom from the City Attorney's Office, and Dr. Pickle has also joined us from the RPA. So with this, Neil is going to go through the presentation. I believe you have the report, but we have a PowerPoint that will walk through on our response and what we've done in response to those motions back in 2012.
Jeff, it's a little context. So I briefly went through it that in 2012 there was the last rate case. What was the duration of that rate case? And during the course of that process, it was suggested that we should do a couple of things. So just
right.
Give us a little
So as part of that was Dr. Pickle can talk about it, but he had just come on when this rate case went through. And in response to that rate case, and it was on the electric side, there were 10 motions that the City Council passed and gave us basically a roadmap for what we need to complete before we come back for a future rate action. So that rate action was it was effective November of 2012, and it was a 2-year rate action, so for 12-13 and 13-14, and we've actually been at the same rates since that time. We have not changed we have not had a rate ordinance change. So we went through and done a lot of work on this with these 10 different actions that included major things that have helped us to save costs, such as a new labor agreement, benchmarking, all those different things. But it was what the direction of City Council was for us to do this before we come back with the rate.
And the idea was that if we took a look at these 10 different items, we would, in theory, be able to mitigate some of the increases in the future, right?
Right, and in fact, that has been the case. Like I said, it was planned that we would have a rate action in 14-15, which in fact we did not have one.
Yeah, and probably unbeknownst to this newer council, some of those things, for example, the MOU and the negotiation with our labor partners was one of those elements. So
right.
With that, Neil, take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Neil Guglielmo with LA Water and Power. So I'll start off with slide 1. This slide identifies the 10 recommendations that stem from the council follow-up to the rate action in 2012. I'm not going to go through each individual item on this page, but I will on the next. But as you can see there, we have worked on every single one of these recommendations and either completed them or made considerable progress. In some cases, some of the items are going to be ongoing. We're looking continuously for savings and opportunities there. Okay, so on this next slide here, this just provides a little more context for some of these items. Working with our labor partners, that is item A, the creation of the new MOU, the MOU that we have currently, resulted in savings of $456 million over the 4-year period, and $5 billion in savings, frankly, over a 30-year period. A lot of structural changes made, including the creation of a new pension tier, for example. The next item, reevaluate and consider replacing the surcharge-based restructuring approach with fully structured permanent rates there's been ongoing discussion with City Attorney's Office, with the Office of the Ratepayer Advocate, and no change is recommended for that approach at this time, largely because of Proposition 26 compliance issues. But at this point in time, while we do have a number of, we believe to be strategic improvements in the ordinance for both water and power, including the inclusion of performance metrics, restructuring some of those items going back would be difficult to do. And we'd be happy to have further discussions, perhaps in a closed session with the City Attorney's Office on the legal ramifications. So the next item is conducting a formal cost of service study, and we've done that for both water and power. We have done marginal cost-based studies, and we've also completed embedded cost of service studies as well, so we can check what the results were against the two. Item D, conducting a benchmarking assessment. As you know, we've completed Phase 1 benchmarking. We're about to commence Phase 2 benchmarking with the assistance and oversight of the RPA as well. And after Phase 2, I know we'll go through Phase 3 and ongoing benchmarking efforts. Item E, so the completion of Phase 1 benchmarking was January 2015. Phase 2 is about to start. We're going to be going to more detailed analysis of some of our labor compensation elements, staffing issues as well. Item F, the department projects a significant reduction of overtime from historical levels. Item F was the review of the overtime expense allocation. We do have some high levels of overtime. A lot of that is to respond to breaks and outages we have within our system. So that is operational, that's causing some of that overtime, but we are doing a review of overtime now, and I think as a result of the labor analysis that was done through the RPA and their consultants I should say, have really pointed out that our overtime seems to be high when compared against some of their benchmarks, some of their agencies. So that is something that's going to continue to be a focus for us, hence the work ongoing for that item. Completing a rigorous review of the department's hedging plan to lock in low fuel prices. So that item is completed. Nearest fiscal year should be 50% hedged, and there should be less than 1% volatility in the rate changes due to gas price volatility. And a little note to mention is gas prices have come down and has resulted in lower rates this year for our customers. So because that's a pass-through, it means that we can pass those savings directly on to our customers, which is great for our customers this year.
Neil, and just on that point, so I don't forget it later, where do we get our gas from?
So our gas, I mean, we buy at the market. We also have a gas field that's in Wyoming. We have a number of gas lines that we have access to. So a lot of where we get our gas from really is the western United States. So and we can have somebody from the power system if you want to get more specifics on where we get the natural gas for. Our natural gas plants are in basin, so we have the Scattergood, which is out by the airport, the Valley, obviously in the Valley, Haynes Power Plant, which is down by Seal Beach, and then the Harbor Power Plant. And we also have one that's out north of Las Vegas as well, the Apex Power Plant, which is a natural gas.
And how much do we get from Southern California gas as a percentage of our entire?
Let me see. I don't know if John Dennis or he doesn't have that data. We can get that data for you.
I can provide some insight into that. Gas is provided by displacement in many cases, but all of the gas at the coastal power plants would be provided through transport by SoCal Gas.
Right.
DWP would buy the gas from third parties, typically, or from facilities it owns in Wyoming that would be transported on pipelines. You'd pay to transport it on the pipelines, and you would pay SoCal Gas to transport it within the state or within the basin. So all the coastal power plants, to my knowledge, are served solely by SoCal Gas.
Right.
And so, I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get further into the integrated resource plan. But I mean, it's more than just sort of the purchases and the supply; it's distribution. And so everything flows through Southern California Gas.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, even when I'm talking about our gas field in Wyoming, ultimately that comes through the Southern California Gas to get to our power plants.
So, I mean, our supply future is directly linked to their distribution system. So
It
if
is.
there are closures or they stop operations, then we're going to have to figure out how it is to get our gas into our system.
The challenge is peak loads within Southern California at peak periods in the summer when there's a lot of electric generation, and peak periods in the winter when it's cold and there's a big heating load have to be served in part out of storage fields because there's not enough total pipeline capacity of all pipelines into the local basin to serve those peak needs.
Got it. Again, I think this is going to be an interesting conversation in light of what's happening.
One footnote, there is a notable exception. The Apex plant
Right.
is served through pipelines, but not through SoCalGas.
Right.
Okay, great.
H.
Okay, for item H, establishing a plan for energy efficiency that maintains expenditure levels at achievable and cost-effective level. So an energy efficiency potential study was completed. The target that we have is set for us is a 15% energy efficiency by 2020, and that's compared against the 2010 baseline. Our board has formally adopted this 50% energy efficiency goal as well, and it's reflected. So we had that item as completed. Item I is seeking greater departmental efficiencies by pursuing process improvement efforts across a range of areas and practices. This is a great item because there's so much work that has been done and still can be done. Again, creation of a new corporate performance group, the completion of Phase 1 benchmarking, which identified a number of areas for us to work on, initiation of Phase 2 benchmarking in partnership with the RPA, implementation of ComStat, business improvement processes, mapping studies for Phase 2, cost reduction plan, and as well as the MOU negotiations. So quite a few items in terms of efficiencies and finding ways in which we can reduce and control our costs. Submission of a semi-annual report to the mayor and the council regarding the status of renewable portfolio standards, or RPS, and its impact on rates. Those reports are provided monthly to our board on the status of the RPS programs and quarterly to the board on costs that may impact future rates. And significant costs, which have the potential to impact long-term rates, are reported to the board and the city as well. So this will be an ongoing item for us with those reports. And that takes us through the summary level of those 10 items. The next few slides are just kind of a deeper dive into each individual item, provides more context, more information, specific, and I'm happy to walk through each of these if you like. Item A, which is, again, our partnership with labor and finding efficiencies and common ground. New MOU term extended through September of 2017. The 2.9% COLA was deferred to October of 2016. The creation of a new pension tier, Tier 2, for new employees. And important to note there is roughly 40% or more of our employees are eligible to retire over the next 5 years. That's a significant portion of our workforce. So while the new employees will be coming in, obviously what concerns us is that knowledge transfer and ensuring that all those really skilled, experienced employees, we don't lose those vital services without bringing in a new trained crop of trained staff. So.
And I think the good news there is in the last IRP, this is one of sort of a new chapter in the integrated resource plan to figure out how it is that we have that warm transfer of information. I think it begs an awful lot of questions about the personnel functions and how quickly they're able to meet our needs. I think the billing situation that we had is just one example of how rigorous it is to get personnel synced with the utilities needs. In anticipation of the IRP conversation that we're going to have, I imagine that you all are going to address some of those challenges again, because it's about 34% that can attrit today of the workforce. Is that right? I mean, thereabouts?
Yeah, somewhere in there, yeah.
So it's probably an updated report on how it is that we're going to try to close that gap in queuing, waiting, lists, all of that sort of stuff. I imagine you'll address that.
Right, and for us, it's obviously not just, bringing those employees into the system, those new employees, but it's the training too. For some of our operational classes, the training could be weeks, months, potentially even years. And so how you time that so you can bring the employees in a timely manner and also for those classes where it's going to require significant training, have the resources to train them, have the capacity to train them, so that they are prepared to go onto those crews and perform those critical services in the field. That's obviously very key for us too. So
In rough numbers, what is 34% of your workforce?
It's about 3,000. I mean, we got about
9,200
9,200
right now.
people. Yeah.
Okay.
Click.
Sure. Sorry. There we go. I'll move on to item B, but feel free to stop me if you have questions as we go
Sure,
through
and
this.
colleagues, as we're going through them, feel free to sort of let me know if you want to talk about some of these issues. I want to talk a little bit about B here as soon as Neil, as you're done, Neil.
Certainly. So again, working with the RPA and the Office of the City Attorney, this has to do with the item here, reevaluate and consider replacing the surcharge-based restructuring approach with fully restructured permanent rates once legal considerations allow. Due to pending litigation that we have on the annual transfer, the department, as advised by the city attorney, is continuing to adopt the electric rate structure that preserves the 2008 rate structure and layers incremental changes and charges on top of the applicable existing charges of the 2008 ordinance. The results of the department's recently conducted cost service study and the impact of new revenue requirements for power service will be applied to only the proposed incremental electric rate ordinance. So I know you have questions, sir.
I do. So the reason that it's structured that way in the last rate case, there's a demarcation effectively because of Proposition 26, right? So the revenues below the Proposition 26, 2010, is that right?
Yep. Correct.
Is, what is it these days, about $240, $250 million?
So that's probably 88% of our revenue stream. So you're looking at something like $3 billion somewhere in there.
How much now?
$3 billion.
$3 billion?
Yeah, is below that. Yeah.
Oh, I'm talking about the transfer.
Oh, you're talking about the transfer. Oh, that's.
We were talking about total power.
Yeah, I thought you were talking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's somewhere in the 240 million range.
$240 million. And so the way, so let me just zoom out a little bit. So the thinking, help me understand what the thinking was by the 2012, 2011 council when they said, consider replacing surcharge-based rate making. What is surcharge-based rate making?
I'm going to look to my city attorney to.
I believe that the structure that's in place now, which is surcharge-based rate making, is really a structure that, as you will see it in the rates, there are many add-ons that, for example, pass-throughs, for example, for energy cost and such, that are put into the structure that then are added up together to then equal out to a rate for a consumer. I think what you will more typically see in a non-surcharge-based rate structure is one where you will say, okay, for a kilowatt hour of electricity, it will be 14 cents or 15 cents, and it won't have a lot of these different add-ons or surcharges as part of as components of the structure. I think the department ends up at a place where you're able to say there's a 14 or 15 cent per kilowatt hour rate, but there are many components to it that add into what that that cents per kilowatt hour is. So that's what has happened. I think the one caution I would have as being with the city attorney's office is we've had this, we've had some discussions with the council in closed session concerning the litigation. I would just want to make sure that if we stray too far into some of the issues relative to the litigation.
And I can certainly appreciate that, which is why I'm so happy we've got two city attorneys here to put the brakes on my questions if you think that we're getting too close.
Certainly.
But I think it's important for me at least, and maybe my colleagues, to understand what the thinking was in this recommendation. The recommendation was to investigate replacing that method of rate making.
Right.
Because, let me see if I can paraphrase, the rate making prior to that was fairly simple. A kilowatt hour is whatever a kilowatt hour is going to be.
Well, I think my understanding of it, when we say prior to, my understanding, and again, I was not here at the city attorney's office in that time period, but I believe that the surcharge approach had already been in place for some period of time prior to 2008. There had been components of the rates that were already surcharge-based, and Jeff, is that correct?
I mean, the one thing, I guess, when we go through on the next item, I have a graphic that we can go through a lot of this that will show how the rates are structured. Essentially, though, we've got our rates that were in place as of November 3, 2010, which did have some surcharge. My belief, what the intent here was, the rates that we passed in 2012 were incremental rates. That's what they're called technically. And if there's an opportunity to get rid of those incremental rates, which make it more complex, we were going to investigate whether or not we can do that. Again, as the city attorney has spoken, there's certainly pending litigation that would seem not to drive us to that conclusion.
Well, so that's the point that I want to make. So you have a very complicated layer cake of rates that we've created because in 2010 it was anticipated that we had to do that to be able to create some legal certainty. Subsequent to that rate-making process and layering, then we were sued after that. We didn't do it because we were in a lawsuit.
Correct.
We did it in anticipation of potential legal challenges. Lo and behold, we get legal challenges.
Right.
Right.
And so as a result, the recommendation is to stay the course on rate making because of the legal challenges. I think that there are inherent savings potentially in rate making if you didn't have this complicated layered approach in getting to what you all we believe to be the same conclusion anyways. I think there's ways for us to go about that. But in order to do that, we'd have to be conscious of the legal cases that are pending. There's three, right? The challenge, the transfer in total or parts of the transfer.
That's correct.
And in order to sort of do something differently, we'd have to, and we've talked about it in this committee, we'd have to ask the voters for permission to do that, to get away from the Prop 26 liabilities. In a very simplified kind of way.
That's correct.
So the point is that the recommendation by the department today is to stay the course because it's of litigation, but there are ways to fix rate making. We just have to figure, and when I say fix, there are ways to make rate making in a form other than the surcharge-based layering that we're doing now.
That's correct.
Okay.
There are.
But it requires the vote of the people.
Well, so there's a bunch of different ways to get to it. One would be a vote of the people. One would be a settlement with these folks potentially so that we don't get sued again, but we probably would. My point is that we built rates a certain way in anticipation of challenges. We got the challenges anyways, and we're continuing to build rates the way that,
To protect us from those challenges.
which is to say that I think there's added expense in the rates.
Right, and just to clarify, it's not, I mean, it's really that, given that those challenges are now here, we believe that the appropriate course is to continue to do what we have done. We will have to see what a court says as to whether the city is protected or not.
Right. And just as a placeholder, when we get to item 2, you'll see what I'm talking about, the layers. So questions on that piece, colleagues? Okay, very good. So I just wanted to sort of, again, plant a seed here on rate making. All right, so C.
So item C is conducting a new formal cost service study in order to prepare for future power rate restructuring. In fact, we did complete cost service studies for both water and power. And as I mentioned earlier, we used a marginal cost basis for that cost service study for both water and power. We also conducted an embedded cost service as well to kind of check and see where things fell between the two cost service studies, and they fell very, very close. The new cost service studies by themselves have no impact on the overall revenue requirements. However, the results are used to allocate cost amongst our customer classes and provide guidance on rate design. And you can see here the charts show you the results of the water cost service study and the power cost service study.
And this is because we want to be in compliance with Proposition 218 and 26.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay, so that's why we're, not to mention we should do this anyways.
Yes.
It's a good practice, but it's the belt and suspenders to further challenges because of the lawsuits that we've seen out there on tiers and this sort of stuff. That's why we do cost-based recovery studies.
Yeah, we're really required now going forward because of both of those propositions to do this on our rate making.
All right.
But it's good practice to do that in any case.
Sure, and the benchmarking, which when we get to is something that I think we can be proud of because it helps us understand. But aside from good practice, it's the law as we make rates.
Correct.
Okay.
Right, and the only caveat on that is that to the extent that there are there are determinations that the law doesn't quite extend to everything that the city has done, meaning the pre-2010 ordinance, that may not be the law, but otherwise, you're absolutely correct.
But it's belt and suspenders so that,
Correct.
because there is some concern about the pre-Prop 26 transfer, I would imagine.
That's correct.
Okay, all right.
Just on this, is
Yeah.
the Schedule F public irrigation, where that's the one that's most out of whack proportionally? Does that create any liability that's, twice as much?
So,
Go ahead.
I was going to say,
That it's such a small percentage, it doesn't matter.
it's a relatively small number of customers. Public irrigation, you can talk about parks, educational facilities and such, community gardens. What we've proposed as part of the rate proposal that I'll be coming forward to you soon is actually to address the cost service and bring the Schedule F customers up to what it costs to serve them through this rate period. So the rate action would actually bring them up to their cost of service.
But I think, Councilmember, you hit the nail on the head. That is the biggest change. While it's not overall revenue-wise for those customers, it's a very significant change because it's so different from the cost to serve than what the actual revenues are today.
But the thinking, I'm sorry, just on this point, is that we can true up that over the course of this proposed rate case.
Correct.
Right.
And we think that that will pass legal muster?
So what we have discussed also is trying to design the rates in light of avoidance of rate shock to our customers. And this avoidance of rate shock is a principle that is recognized, and I won't speak for the RP. I'll let him talk about it because he knows it better even than I do. And so that's why we've looked at this approach to phase it in over that rate period.
Okay.
You can phase it in over X number of years, you avoid the rate shock problem, but you still show that you're on the road to equalization.
Correct.
Now, you could, if it were to go to a vote of the people change, you could bake in things like this if they make sense from a policy perspective, right? Because public irrigation, rec and parks, things like that, we may want to, as a policy, essentially subsidize that, right? Under the current.
You're correct. Assuming that it's determined that these things can't be done under the current structure, that they are in violation of Proposition, in this case, 218, then certainly a ballot measure that called for those kinds of measures that would then be deemed taxes of various kinds, if the voters approve of them in the right majority, whether it's majority or two-thirds majority, could be adopted by the people, and they can be perpetuated for whatever term is called for in the amendment. That's correct.
But absent something like that, we have to go through this process of
That's correct.
truing up, as you're talking about.
That's correct.
And it is, as it's been explained to me, 218 has a fairly hard cost allocation standard. Prop 26 does have a fairness standard as part of the allocation, but that doesn't apply in the case of water. And no one's really tested the limits of the fairness standard.
They carved out water out of 218?
226.
26 is not covered, doesn't cover water,
Covers power.
covers power.
And 26 has the fairness provision,
Yes.
which allows the longer term.
May allow, hasn't been
May
tested.
allow the longer term
Hasn't been
true up.
tested.
Right.
So
And this is the place where I start getting very nervous and saying that I don't want to have any of the discussion we have here be used in a manner that is, in the nature of legal advice that we are providing to the council. And so if we're going to, I don't have any problem with having the discussion. I just don't want to have the discussion necessarily in open session.
Understood. And I think just to sort of, put a finer point, there's doctrine that we believe that justifies the rate case that's being proposed. Maybe not explicit in Proposition 26, but implied in a fairness standard. So that's enough around the edges there where we can talk about it later. But
Right.
But it is an issue, and I'm glad that you pointed it out, Mr. Blumenfield.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Chair.
So item D, again, this is in the benchmarking assessment to review the costs per project for repowering program and the Power Reliability Program, otherwise now known as the Power System Reliability Program, or PSRP, to ensure cost reasonableness. On the repowering program, the department relied upon a highly competitive procurement process for the coastal plant repowering. Use of new construction bids for similar combined cycle generating units. A separate power plant procurement process is underway for comparative purposes and analysis. Actual award prices for the repowering projects have come within the median pricing range of the new projects proposed by various other competitive proposers for the Navajo replacement project. And of course, we do have Power System staff here too to answer questions if you have them.
Well, just the one question on that, and I know it's more of an IRP thing, but because it was talked about here, are we what is the status of that repowering effort? I mean, are we on schedule?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
For the Power System Reliability Program, a detailed assessment of the reliability capital program expenditures and methodologies has been done. It was completed. Based on discussions that we've had with the RPA, the department has formulated an achievable, we believe to be an achievable PSRP spending plan going forward. Actually, in considering what the findings were of the assessment, and I think also Navigant's review also pointed this out, is there a significant need for an investment that we have in the infrastructure, and that even with the proposed rates, that it will help take us in the right direction, but it's not going to be sufficient even to kind of maybe get to the level of spending that we'd like to see, the level of work we'd like to see on the infrastructure. It's going to continue to be an issue for us. We believe that the proposal and the budgets that we have within the 5-year spending profile are achievable, though, and will make considerable progress for us in serving our ratepayers. But it is an area that we're going to be focusing on closely, and there's a number of performance metrics specific to the PSRP that have been developed or that are part of the proposed power rate ordinance as well. We have a number of other metrics tied to water, but specifically there's quite a few metrics tied to the PSRP in that power rate ordinance.
And we expect to refine those metrics over time, which is allowed under this proposed structure.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on to the next item. Identifying opportunities to contract out and explore potential savings, including the benchmarking of staffing and outsourcing levels against utility peers. At least I have next to me someone who's been intimately involved in Phase 1 benchmarking. So we've completed that high-level benchmarking assessment. As you can see there, we are going to begin that Phase 2. We're going to be in discussions very shortly with our RPA for that Phase 2.
Tomorrow in detail?
Tomorrow. It's actually Thursday, yes. So we do have a number of areas that were identified through the high-level benchmarking where we found to be comparable or even better than industry performance. There are also areas for improvement that we have found. Those findings will be used by us as a roadmap to identify others for more in-depth analysis as part of Phase 2. And of course, subsequent to that, we'll have Phase 3. But as we look at benchmarking, it's just going to be an ongoing effort. I mean, Phase 1 has been completed, Phase 2 will be done, Phase 3 will be done. But really to be effective, benchmarking will have to continue. And it has to be integrated fully into the organization as we've been working on.
And the one thing I would just say about Phase 2, we are working on a collaborative process with the OPA. We're looking forward to peeling the onion the next number of layers. We're going to look at number of people. We're going to look at use of contractors, overall cost of different functions and sub-functions. So it'll really help us to get to that roadmap on Phase 3 where we can specifically identify where can we use contracting, where are we not using contracting as much as somebody else, how many people do we have. Okay, even if you're not using contracting, how do your costs compare to other functions and sub-functions? Of peer utilities. So
in that benchmarking, I mean, I remember, colleagues, I'm sure you do too, how good of a presentation it was, and it was a real honest look as to where we sort of rank and which quartile and that sort of thing. But as you begin Phase 2 and Phase 3 and you benchmark, will you also help us understand from a personnel perspective where it is that, I mean, it's one thing to recognize that you've got to prioritize customer service and here's where we rank. It's another thing in your plan to help us understand how it is that you get there fast enough. Will that be part of a Phase 2 or Phase 3?
No, that's part of the Phase 2. We're actually going to look at, again, against a number of peer utilities, how many people, I'll use customer service as an example, how many people do they have in customer service, how many people do they have in the different sub-functions of customer service as well. How does that compare to DWP? And beyond that, we want to look at how much do they use for contracting, how much do we use for contracting, what is the overall cost of the different functions and sub-functions. So it'll give us a much better look, which will help us as we move forward and moving the utility to be more efficient. we may be overstaffed in some place, we may be understaffed somewhere else, we may be not using enough contracts. That's what we're going to find out with this new collaborative effort with Dr. Pickle's office.
The purpose of this is not to study it to death.
Right.
It's to identify areas that need help and might be able to help be helped immediately in some ways.
Right.
At the same, while you're digging deeper.
Sure. Mr. Blumenfield?
Just on the peer studies, who you pick as your peers can make a big difference. You know, California has a lot of regulations other states don't. So how are you determining in each of these who's the peer or do you have separate like national peers versus California or regional
Right.
peers?
So that's what, and again, part of what we're going to have to collaboratively look at is the databases available from different contractors, but we will look at peers in the western United States. We want to look at larger peers that are more of the size of DWP. We can look nationally as well. If you remember the phase one, we were comparing ourselves on the western as well as the large utilities across the country.
Right. Both, you could have a very skewed perspective one way or the other if
Right.
you don't have the right peer set.
Clear.
Correct. Okay. Moving on to item F. This is the item where discussion of review of overtime expense allocations and the department's contractual requirements that have an impact on overtime. The current MOU with IBW Local 18 has key provisions in it for reducing overtime as a consequence of obtaining contracting out services. Overtime is considered a safe and cost-effective means for us of meeting necessary workload demands when used in moderation. It is a good utility practice to use overtime at the rate of roughly 15% of regular labor costs. Overall, overtime averaged 17.3% for the period 2008-9 through 13-14. However, the estimate for the 5-year rate period reflects a significant reduction to 13.4% that we're hoping, that's a target for us, that we're hoping we can achieve. But some of that will be dependent upon conditions for operations. So if we happen to see, again, windstorms, that impacts overtime, the need to go out and restore power to our customers. If there's other situations beyond windstorms, flooding or anything else like that, those can all further impact overtime usage as well. The table here just shows the overtime as broken down by our different systems, our power system, water system, and joint system, and of course the overall, then the average over the 5-year rate period.
When we did a total compensation benchmarking, and one item that stood out in that benchmarking was the cost for overtime, and it was using the highest number in this group, that is fiscal year 14-15. But that was a outlier number relative to a lot of peers.
It is a focus ongoing review for us, so that's something that we're going to continue to work on.
Is there a reason for that anomaly, or is it anything to do with the billing system or anything like that?
For that particular fiscal year?
Yeah, I think most of what that fiscal year had something to do with response to outages. I know, especially on the water side, they were trying to respond very quickly because of water conservation. And I think we'd have to get you more detail on that. I know that was one of the reasons for water.
And that's one of the areas for further follow-up
review. Right.
as we move forward.
Right.
So item G, completion of a rigorous review of the department's hedging plan to lock in low fuel prices. Really the objective of our hedging program is to reduce volatility. That's really what it comes down to. And it's not necessarily to reduce the cost of fuel. We have a goal, a near-term goal, 50% hedged through financial hedges, power hedges, physical hedges, and gas reserves. Goal of executing hedges such that the unplanned rate changes will not, with a 95% confidence level, vary by more than 1% for the announced level due to natural gas volatility. Down below, you can see some graphics. Those are taken from the reports we prepare and provide to our board. Item H, establishing a plan for energy efficiency that maintains expenditure levels at an achievable and cost-effective level. As I mentioned earlier, we have completed that energy efficiency potential study. The goal is 15% by 2020. What you see down below, the major programs that are included in the new EE Portfolio Business Plan that are projected to accrue those savings, the mass market, commercial industrial, cost-cutting, or I should say cross-cutting, over the 5-year period. So that's all the EE efforts. And then lastly, seeking greater departmental efficiencies by pursuing process improvement efforts across a range of areas and practices. We've covered a number of these already, from benchmarking to ComStat, the various cost reduction efforts that we've undergone, and of course the new MOU. We consider this work to be ongoing and look forward to identifying additional efficiencies going forward.
Productivity improvement is important for the department, and hopefully we can make progress in multiple areas to try to improve that overall productivity.
Item J, let me catch up here. A submission of an annual report to the Mayor and Council regarding the status of the Renewable Portfolio Standards, or RPS program, and its impact on rates. We talked a little bit about this earlier, and I think you, Councilman, you wanted to have some further discussion on RPS, I think is...
Well, I just wanted to get a sense for where we are. I understand that our accounting and the Energy Commission's might not be completely in sync. So what is it that the Energy Commission is saying, and what is it that we're saying? And as a precursor, I think, Bob, you'll remember when we were in the legislature, we passed a 33% renewable portfolio standard. The department has been working diligently on making sure that we comply with those mandates. It's my sense that they've always strove to get closer to 40% RPS in anticipation of the legislature eventually moving the line, which they did in SB 350. And so now the goal is 50% by 2050. But where are we today with the timelines? Because I think the last check-in, is it January 1 or 2? The most recent check-in is January 1, 2016, or is it 13? I'm confused as to. I forget the numbers.
There's
the
two
dates.
compliance periods right now that we're looking back at 2011 through 2013. So we're actually looking through compliance period 1, where we're to be at 20% renewables. By the end of compliance period 2, which is 2014, 15, and 16, we're to be at 25% at the end, or there at the conclusion of that. Just yesterday, there were some reports that came out, some information about our compliance during compliance period 1, and we're still working with the staff to identify our record keeping and the accounting towards some of the questions that they had about use of biomethane and some of our accounting methods and such that are there.
But the long story short is they say that we've missed the mark by about 4%. We say that we haven't. We're going to sort it out, but there is some controversy as to whether we're in compliance in period 1.
That's correct. So we had 13.7 million renewable credits that were all involved. There was some question mark about 2.7 million credits. And just 2 days ago, then they said, we look like we're okay with 2 million of those 2.7 million credits. And so we're working through some of those details, had even discussion just moments ago with the staff, but we feel that those are all defensible of what we've done to achieve the 20% for compliance period 1.
Okay, and so, but the point is that we haven't gotten the green light that we're in the clear, we're in dispute, and we're working it out. But it's with the Energy Commission, which is to say that it is a voluntary reporting period, because we worked very diligently to make sure that the City of Los Angeles's Department of Water and Power didn't have to report to the Public Utilities Commission. And if we were an IOU and had to report to the PUC, there would be financial penalties if it was deemed eventually that we didn't satisfy a compliance period. But because we're reporting to the Energy Commission voluntarily, but we're doing the right thing by the environment and everything else, would we, if we were found out of compliance, have to pay penalties?
The payment is still another entity with the California Air Resources Board that would have to have that finding.
But the way the legislation was written is that the PUC is the one that would tell the ARB. We're an anomaly because we're the only utility that responds to the Energy Commission. And so if we don't agree, will we eventually end up paying penalties if for some reason we lost?
I think it's fair to say is that there's still a lot of room for discussion over that matter. And we believe, I think most importantly is before even compliance period 1 started, LA was ahead of the game to achieve renewable, our portfolio at 20%. And so we're also getting recognition for grandfathering those even before the rules were in place.
No, and we worked diligently to make sure that we would get credit for that.
Yes.
When we were in the legislature, but at the end of the day, the referee is the Energy Commission. And we can cry foul to the ARB potentially, but right now,
Correct.
it's not as if there's agreement that we've satisfied the first compliance period. We're in the talks of trying to convince them that we have.
And those discussions are very healthy right now.
Very good. All right. Well, I just wanted to say that we don't have the, our visa isn't stamped is my point. Okay.
That completes the presentation slides.
Very good. Colleagues, do you have any questions on any of that? Mr. O'Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for the presentation. I'm struggling to understand the second graph on page 9, the cost of service studies, marginal cost revenue requirement graph. Could you break down R1 asterisk, RA1 asterisk, and so on?
So the marginal cost of service study looks at how much does it cost you for the next, in this case we're talking about power, for the next kilowatt or kilowatt hour, and it then identifies it or allocates it based on that to each class. So
A is allocation?
Well, so if you look at, no, the ones on the below, those are our classes for our customers. So R1 is our residential, A1 is small commercial, A2 is medium,
Got it.
A3.
Okay.
And then when you look at the red is the marginal cost revenue requirement. So that's based on that study. And then the green is actually the current revenue that we're collecting. I think this is based on 14, 15, if I'm not mistaken.
No.
12, 13. So basically what it's looking at is the 12, 13 fiscal year that the residential, in this case, 32.9% of the revenue came from the residential class.
Okay. It's still a little confusing, I think, probably to the average person, and count me among that, an average person. A question also on the, let's see. The report also, you checked A on page 2 of the report in relation to the negotiations, the finding common ground, the flexibility, cost benefit for salaries, to bring the salaries down. Is part of your justification the chart F, the overtime information? Is that how you kind of explain that you've done your diligence on that piece of it? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So on item A, this is the conduction of the negotiations, the labor partners. We did check that as something that we have made progress, but work is ongoing because there's still things we'd like to try and accomplish the next round of negotiations with labor partners. One of the elements that we were successful in doing was the contracting note overtime restriction was at 10%. As part of the results of the negotiations, that was brought down to 5%. So that's something that helps us reduce that overtime. So that contributes through the 5-year rate period where you can see the overtime is going down. That helps us contribute to that reduction in overtime.
From 10 to 5?
The 10 to 5% that was required as a result of the contracting restriction that was in the MOU.
Right.
Thanks.
And if I can go back to the cost of service, just wanted to make it really simple, as much as I can at least. When you look at the cost service bars, the red and the green, the objective is to have them line up.
Right.
So if they don't line up in the very beginning, then at the end of the rate period, to have those lineups, they're equal. That's our objective.
And so how much, the law doesn't sort of prescribe how much flexibility you've got. I mean, because I don't think that we ever sort of hit it spot on. So you look at a rate case, the duration of it, and it just has to be pretty darn close.
That's
Right, I mean, so how much flexibility is actually in the law in terms of?
I don't, it isn't very clear at this point, either on the water side or the electric side, exactly how clear it is, how close you have to be. I think the point, as Neil said, is you're trying to move it so that it's closer to being in parity.
Right.
But the expectation, because cost of service analyses by their definition are always not perfect.
Right.
You're not going to have absolute parity. You never will.
It's more about the effort, it appears, and sort of the duration of a case to sort of say that if we're out of whack, we're
Moving it in the right direction, and on in the grand scheme, it's about right. Our belief would be that it can't be expected to be perfect, because that's an impossible place to be.
The marginal costs can be quite sensitive over time, so getting things close is really the objective. You're not going to get and keep it exactly aligned ever.
Mr. Blumenfield.
A couple of narrow questions. You talk about the one of the categories we didn't do very well in the benchmarking was the uncollectible expenses. In the main report, it's under item E. We're talking about other areas are collecting more. If we were benchmarked about right, we'd be collecting another 12 million or 23 million per year. Have we put a plan in place to figure that out, or what's the reason for that, or what's the fix on that particular one?
I know the customer services organization was obtaining some consultants to come in and help them with that. I'm not sure of the interplay between that as well as the class action lawsuit. I think that may have had some impacts on the timing of that, but they were obtaining some outside help to work on the policies and procedures to bring that uncollectible down. I think it was 0.35% was what the median level was, if my memory serves me correct, and we were at about 0.7%.
Yeah, we're at 0.72, and
Right.
it doesn't say what's
Right.
but
Yeah. So there is some issues on the class action lawsuit and how that interplays with that, on the requirements of that with the new Syscon implementation.
And we have seen some success. I mean, in terms of the water uncollectibles, the amount of that accounts receivable has come down. That trajectory has definitely come down. So we are above where we were prior to the go live of Syscon, but it is approaching that level, that pre-Syscon level.
And I was wondering if that was a function of our whole billing problem. If that was sort of do we write it off as the bump in the road when we had our billing, or is it a more systemic problem because the benchmarking takes place before our billing process ever started?
Right. I think before the billing system started, that's where we were at, the 0.7%, which seems to be about double of what the median is, even when we looked at other investor or other municipally owned utilities. So again, that's a policies and procedures that we got to set up on how we do that. And again, it's a tougher issue.
It may actually have gotten worse over the course of this year.
Yeah,
probably.
Right.
So that's I guess a red flag for us to
Right.
to go down.
Right.
Just on the diagrams, you're talking about in the hedging department, the last 3 years we didn't do any financial or physical gas hedges.
So maybe if I could just expand on that. So in the past, this hedging policy was put in place, I want to say 2005, 2006, in a drastically different time. What we have had is we had some consultants come in, look at this, and they gave us recommendations on how we should set the hedging up. So again, as Neil talked about, hedging is not to save costs. It is to reduce the volatility. And what the recommendation was, and if I can say it simply, is 5 years out, we want to hedge roughly 10%. We want to buy 10% of our gas. The closer year, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%. So it's very programmatic on how we buy that gas. What you're seeing there on the purple, that is actually the gas field that we were talking about. So we know we have that gas available because it's come from the gas field that we already own. And then you can see as we get closer, we're 16, 17, I think we're just a little bit over 50%. 17, 18, we're getting higher. We're now starting to implement that policy. We had to go through a couple of steps to ensure that we could do some financial hedges as well. But our target is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% that we will buy. So we take the pricing that occurs over that 5-year period and phase that in so that we see less volatility. I mean, one thing just to remember, when this was, lock in low fuel prices, at the time, many of us thought, hey, this is the lowest fuel price, we should go out and buy it, me included. Wasn't.
Fuel prices have
Fuel prices have come down even further. So that's why we want to do it in a programmatic fashion. We don't want anybody trying to gain the market or I mean, we wouldn't be here if we could actually figure out the market ahead of time. We want to be programmatic about it.
But what surprised me was the reduction and elimination of the financial hedges, because that seems like that's the easiest to predict. It's just a formula, right?
Yeah, that was the step that we have now recently, I think in the last month, we have completed the process that we need to have one person in the financial services organization that can now go out and start buying those financial hedges. That's what we're going to use, is the financial hedges more going forward. But we had some issues that we had to get through administratively so that could allow us to do that, and we've now done that.
Now, in this process, all fuel costs are passed through to customers through the energy cost adjustment charges, both the old and the incremental. So really, we're hedging on behalf of the customers here, because customers can't easily do the hedge themselves, but you don't want to hedge too much and for too long, because then if there is a substantial increase in prices, people lose the conservation incentive from the higher prices, but you want to reduce the shock.
Thank you.
Mr. Kretz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Following up on that, I have another question on the hedging. From a climate change perspective, obviously at some point when we have the technology to reduce or eliminate fossil fuel purchases, which at some point we will find desirable and possible, any chance that we will have locked in too higher percentage or too many years? Are we looking at that issue as well?
I think that's part of, in the past, we had actually done the same methodology, but going out 10 years. We're now just going out 5 years because that's where we can get, the financial hedges. And again, to your point, we don't want to be locking in something 8-9 years from now that may significantly impact us with different regulations or different conditions. So that's why we're only doing a 5. So we're pretty confident that that shouldn't be the case as we move forward.
Yeah, 5 years seems pretty reasonable, so hopefully we won't look beyond that in the future. Right. I don't know, percentage-wise, you said 50% is the high?
That's the near term.
Yeah, that's the near term. So for the next fiscal year, we want to have 50% of our gas purchases essentially already purchased before we enter that fiscal year. So for next fiscal year, starting in July, we want to have 50% locked in, and then we'll buy 50% on the market base for that year.
And the further you go, it's reduced. So
Reduced,
50,
right.
then 40, 30, 20, and 10.
Okay. And the Aliso Canyon gas leak situation, does that affect our repowering program in any way? And what about if they close down the gas storage field entirely?
Okay.
So you don't have an answer on that?
No, we don't have.
Not right now. I think we can come back to you on that, though.
Okay, and the last side question. My staff just met with UCLA's Director for Sustainable Communities, Stephanie Pincel, and she brought in a web program to show council staff an energy atlas, which can help identify more effective ways to spend our energy efficiency dollars. Have we been in touch with her or UCLA about this? Are we aware of it?
I'm not aware if the energy efficient. I would be willing to bet they probably have been in contact with UCLA on that.
They've had, they have been in contact with UCLA.
Yeah.
I think, do we have any?
They're using our data set.
Yeah, they are using our data set for the energy. Yeah, I'm just not aware of this app or whatever, but they're using our data set on what the average by zip code, and it's on various city websites as well, what the average kilowatt hours.
So we had the conversation with them about what they found and how they can help us.
I believe it's happened with our energy efficiency folks. I'm just not aware of it myself.
We'll take it down and make sure that our sustainability folks get back to your office on that.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Cedillo? Okay, very good. All right, colleagues, that, I think, sort of checks the box on what a previous council has asked us to ask the utility about previous motions. So I think that sets us up nicely for item number 2. Mr. Prieto?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Item number 2.
I'm sorry, Mr. Prieto. So on this one, we're going to go ahead and receive and file, in as much as the information was informational. That shall be the order. Item number 2.
Item number 2. Motion Fuentes Huizar relative to Department of Water and Power to provide an overview of its standard electric rate structure, incremental electric rate structure, and its water rate structure and related matters.
Now, colleagues, this is where I think so the idea was to sort of understand what it is that we had tasked the utility to go and do before the next rate case, and a lot of it's ongoing, so thank you very much for that. This now begins to delve into what rate making is and what it looks like. It's a rates 101, if you will, and hopefully this will inform the conversation that we're going to have at some point in the future about the actual rate case. So with that, Jeff, help us understand how you make rates in Los
So I'm going to walk through what we do on an ongoing basis. So I guess the first thing to do is to apologize that we're going to get into a little complexity on this. We've tried to make it in an understandable fashion how to do it in this short time frame. Please stop me, ask questions.
I don't apologize. I'm absolutely thrilled that we're here today.
And again, my one caveat on this is certainly for purposes of presenting what was done, it makes perfect sense. I think if the council members wish to start asking questions about alternatives and such, I think we at some point may decide that it's better to put this off to a closed session discussion.
Sure,
So that
no,
would be one
and
caveat.
listen, I will try to resist to do that. This is about, I think, just informing us how it is that rates get made, the different layers that go into the rate making, the complexity, and then as it results in sort of our thoughts, I think the rate case, when we get to it, will be the time to sort of ask some more probing questions, and if we have to go into closed session. But colleagues, as you can tell, it's very delicate and litigious, so
It is.
you're warned.
So page 2, just again, what I'm going to walk through is just the general rate making overview. I'll then be more specific to the power rate making overview. We'll get to that chart we were talking about, how our rates are structured, and then the water rate making overview as well.
And I'm sorry, Jeff, before you go on, Mr. Prieto, just to be absolutely clear, there weren't, and Madam Clerk, there weren't any cards on the last item. I don't see any cards on this item either.
No, Mr. Chair, there have been no cards submitted.
Very good. So members of the public, you're welcome to fill out a card if you have anything to say during public comment on this item. But Jeff, continue.
Okay. So again, on the general rate making, on page 4, the first thing we want to talk about is the revenue requirement. The revenue requirement is really how much money do we have to collect. And as you can see here, we work with our financial advisor, PRAG, Public Resources Advisory Group, to look at our financial metrics for both the water and power system. They recommend financial targets. And when we look at these targets, it's something where you have a compromise. You're looking at how high of targets do you want to get the lower interest rate versus you can set the targets a little lower, but you'll have higher interest rate. And so when we look at it, essentially we end up AA minus seems to be the sweet spot. That's the best spot where the lowest revenue requirement. And so the 4 different things that you look at here, and we have for the power system, operating cash target or days cash on hand. This is essentially what's your minimum checking balance, right, in your checking account. You want to have 170 days of operating cash. The full obligation coverage for the power system, 1.7 means the amount of cash that you have available to pay the debt service, and the full obligation includes not only our on-balance sheet debt service, but our off-balance sheet debt service, as well as it includes the city transfer. We want to have basically 1.7 times that amount of those costs remaining in cash balance to do that. Debt service coverage is the same calculation, but it doesn't include any of the off-balance sheet. And then the capitalization ratio, when that says less than 68%, that means our entire capital structure, we don't want to have greater than 68% debt. So it's how much debt are you carrying. Debt's not bad, but you don't want to carry too much debt. And the combination of these targets is what you identify the right rating that you will get in how much, what the interest costs will be as you issue debt. Going forward, and again, we'll talk about this more when we present the rate case, but we're looking at about $1.5 billion per year of debt being issued between water and power. On the water side, we have a little less on the operating cash, but they don't have any off-balance sheet. So the debt service coverage is 1.7, and then the capitalization ratio is 65%. So again, these are formal targets that have been adopted by our board, and these are well received by the financial markets as well. That's something that's actually a strength when we go to the rating agencies. They say you have a formal target that sets your revenue requirement. On the next page, so we just talked about this revenue requirement up here. Again, that's how much money we have to collect in order for us both water and power. The cost of service study, and this was back to what Neil was presenting, that where you had the two, the red and the green. So that's the cost of service study. And the first thing we do with the cost of service study is how much the class allocation is what we call it. So how much revenue should be collected by residential, small commercial, medium, and large commercial, right? That's the residential, A1, A2, A3. And that's the first thing we set is how much money are we going to collect from each class. Very important. You know, we had some prior discussion in the prior item about it, but it's a very important concept. Let me just return. So if you look at this large commercial industrial, that's our A3 class. That's our biggest rate class on the power side. So now from that, on the next page, so on page 6, what I'm demonstrating is we know how much money we have to collect for that class. But the cost of service is now further used to set the rates within that class. So we know how much revenue we have to collect. The first thing we do is we establish each of the different periods. So the different periods that these bills will, the billing determinants will come in. So high peak period, that's when we have the highest power use. So Monday through Friday, 1 to 5 p.m. is when we're at the peak capacity. On a hot August day, that 3:30 to 4:30 is basically where we get that absolute peak. That's what we build all of our capacity for. So the costs are higher for that high peak period, and I'll talk about it on each one of these. The low peak period is basically the 3 hours before the high peak and the 3 hours after. Again, we have a lot of capacity costs. We have different generation. We have transmission that we have to have as well as distribution for that. So those costs are higher, but not as high as the high peak. And then the base period, that's our lowest period. That's before 10 a.m. and after 8 p.m. That's when we have unused capacity that's available and cheaper. One thing just to mention before I get into this, we had one customer a number of years back that's out in the valley. That's a breakfast food manufacturer, without giving away who it is, but I know everybody has been there. And they were making their breakfast food, and they would shut down operations at about 2 p.m. So we worked with them. We said, hey, can you move your time that when you shut down, so by 1 p.m. you're shut down? They said, sure, we'll just do that. Their bill dropped by a third. And that just shows you the concept of, again, we had automatic meter reading where we could show them that, and it's something that you can do with the new technologies. And when customers can get a win-win, and we've done that with other industrial customers as well. So starting with the high peak, and each of these is the same, the first thing we have is the demand or capacity. So that is the flow of electricity at any given time. So what's the highest flow of that electricity during that high peak period? And we're going to charge them based on that flow for the month. The energy is, if you think, the volume. So in water context, the flow of water into a pool at any time, that's the demand. The amount of water you have in your pool is the energy. So we charge for each of these different periods for each one of these. Now in the base period, our demand or capacity charge is actually zero because the customers aren't causing any cost because it's capacity that's there. The High peak period, and I'm just doing this typical for our A2, is about $9.70 on the high peak period. And the low peak period, it's about $3.30. Again, that's all driven by our cost of service study that helps us to determine what those costs are.
Is that a kilowatt hour?
That's per kilowatt.
Per kilowatt.
Right. On the kilowatt hour, the energy charge for the high peak period is 11.6 cents per kilowatt hour. In the high peak, the low peak is 10.9, and then on the base period, it's 8.9 cents. So it just keeps dropping. Now, one of the things as the gas prices have dropped down, it's actually brought those energy prices closer, where before they used to be a lot higher. But again, this is how we structure our rates on everything. The A3 is probably the most sophisticated. So we also have a critical element, and we've done this on the energy side, which is decoupling. The absolute best resource is energy efficiency and water conservation, bar none. And you can spend less money when our energy efficiency people go out and look. They look at what's the price for burning fuel to meet a kilowatt hour. And that includes the RPS costs. It ends up being roughly 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, you can put in energy efficiency that over the lifetime of that energy efficiency measure, it will be lower than 5 cents. So in total, our customers will pay less. The motion that was introduced today goes right to that concept of air conditioning tune-up is something we can do that will be cheaper than burning fuel. It's better from a financial perspective. Of course, being the CFO, that's what the financial perspective is better, but it's also the environmental perspective as well. However, what it does is it reduces down our volumes, so we have to ensure that we recover our fixed costs. So on the power side, this is roughly 50% of our revenue will be our will be our base rate revenue target. On the water, it's roughly 30%. So if we have a hot summer, in the past, we could collect more revenue because you have a lot of, if we have one of those real bad heat spells, that means we're going to sell a lot of power. We would get that and we'd take that cash and use it to cash fund capital. Well, we're not going to be able to do that in the future because now that's going to be credited back to our customer. So it's a two-way street. If we have a cold summer and we don't collect enough or we have a lot of energy efficiency, the following calendar year we will collect some of that initial amount. This really puts fiscal discipline on the department because whatever our targets are on our budget, we can't overspend that.
But we haven't, this rate case is proposing the decoupling mechanism.
Correct.
Prior to this isn't in place today.
We on the power side, we had it for 2 years. So it was in the 2012 fiscal year 12-13 and 13-14 had it. And then, of course, we haven't had it because we don't have a new rate ordinance. We are proposing it for the 5 years coming in the rate ordinance on the power side as well as the water. The water has essentially had something developed in the early 90s. I would call it a crude decoupling method, and it was only a one-way.
So in those 2 years that we did have it, it was two-way.
Right.
And we had some of the highest heat in history. Did we give money back?
It was actually surprisingly close. I want to say it was maybe $20 million or something and it was actually a little bit under. So even though I'm trying to remember that year of being I don't think it was that super hot. It was roughly close to a normal
because the last
summer.
4 years have been hotter than the previous year. So I'm just, because what is so smart about this as proposed in the rate case, and I know that's for a separate conversation, is that it accounts for the fixed costs, but it also works to the benefit of the ratepayer, separate and aside from sort of it being smart for the utility. It, in theory, would bring money back.
Right. Yeah. And
we just haven't seen it yet because we haven't enacted it and we don't have the experience. But in theory, it should bring money back. And
again, not to get into the rate case details, but I know something you specifically had us work on our wholesale revenues. So in the past, we've had wholesale revenues. If there were opportunities, we would sell to other utilities. We have a budgeted amount. Any excess sales on that, we're going to include that in this as well. So that will actually reduce down even further for the customers. That's one of the big measures that we've had that has lowered down our overall rate case. Yeah, over the last 12 years, when I've looked at it, comparing our forecast versus our actual on the power side, we were within roughly 0.3% for the last 12 years. So it's pretty, our estimates have been pretty good.
And then the other piece to that is that it removes that sort of incentive that's out there where people say, oh, they're just going to, they just want us to use more energy up to feather their own nests or
Right.
whatever people think. It removes that by saying that's not our goal. Our
Right.
goal is to meet these targets, and we're, as a utility, we're not making more money or less money.
Right.
It's about conservation.
Correct. And even where we set that target, a lot of the work that Dr. Pickle, his staff, and his consultants have done is to ensure that target lines up with what our budget amounts are. So now I'm going to get specific into the power side. So this is, just an overview on the power is really made up in different places, right? First one is the generation. So the plants out there building or that are generating the power, we see them everywhere as far as we talked about our coastal power plants as well as the valley. And then you have transmission. So you're taking high voltage power coming out of the power plants and you're transmitting it to our locations. We have a vast transportation network or transmission network. I mean, we go all the way from the California-Oregon border. We're coming from Utah. We have, again, a very large transmission network that serves us well. Then you have the receiving stations, which essentially takes in this higher voltage and then puts it out at 34,500 volts, which is still pretty, obviously quite high for all of us that are used to 120. But the one thing to know, and you see here, we see the graphic, the large customer. Our biggest customers are served at that voltage. Many times, and I'm sure you get asked, why is it that an industrial or commercial customer gets a lower rate? The answer is because they're way up here. They're not using any of this part of the system. They're using basically getting served at a very high voltage, so that they get a lower cost because they don't have going into the distribution station, nothing on the poles, all of that. Small customers are served at essentially 4,800 volts, and then you get to the house where it's basically 240, 120, what we're used to seeing. So that's why getting to this lower voltage, that's what costs money, and that's why you end up, again, through the cost of service and engineering principles, why how the rates are developed.
So because I've heard it for many, many, many years. So it's a misnomer when folks say that the residential class subsidizes commercial rates. It's not a subsidy, it's a question of math. Is that?
There's two parts to that question. One, I would say that the residential class will have a higher cents per kilowatt hour because they use much more of the system to get down to that lower voltage. The subsidy between goes back to the marginal cost of service study and those class allocations. But the residential class, again, is going to pay something higher because they're served at a much lower voltage and use a lot more of the system.
But is it a subsidy?
It's not a subsidy as long as it lines up with the cost of service, right?
Okay, so our efforts to line that all up, most recently because of the legal requirements,
right,
makes it so that is going forward should not be the issue.
Should not be the issue.
Got
correct.
it. Okay.
So again, on the power side, the revenue requirement, and this is not on a programmatic. This is more on a financial basis. And I'm not going to go in great details, but again, you see down here O&M labor is roughly 21%. But what really drives it, fuel and purchase power, that's 41% of the total. You have cash funding of our capital program, which is driven by those financial metrics. The transfer, that's 7%, that's 8% of the previous year's gross receipts. And then this is really the debt service, the principal and interest. And then you have O&M materials and other expenses. This is what drives our revenue requirement of how much money we need to collect for this. But the big thing, and I think you've heard, specifically Marcy talk about it, we're only 21% is driven by labor. That's because it's a capital intensive business. We have a lot on fuel and purchase power. I won't go through in detail, but this just shows, as we look forward, we have projections in our budget as to how much money we need, and you can see revenue at the current rates is much much less than what we actually need. And that's the difference in there, is what we need for the new rates versus what we could collect under the old rates. And again, this has it based on that pie chart that we said. You can see the different things that are going up. Purchase power is going up because of RPS as well as other requirements, but all of that is phased in. All of that has been reviewed in great detail by Dr. Pickle, his staff, and their consultant. So legal guidance, two things that really guide us on page 12. The city charter states, principally on this, rates shall be of uniform operation for customers of similar circumstances. That's very important. So again, that gets down to that, how those customers are fed at the different voltages, the nature of uses, the quantity supplied, and the value of the service. And then Prop 26, obviously this is just a paraphrase. It's a charge imposed for a specific government service or product provided directly to the payer shall not exceed the reasonable cost of providing the service or the product to that payer. So that's just obviously very high level on that. And here's the chart we were talking about a little while ago. So if you look down the bottom in the gray right here, we have all those components: the energy cost adjustment, the base rate, reliability cost adjustment, the electric subsidy adjustment, everything that was in the rate as of November 3rd, 2010. So we have left this essentially in place as of November 3rd, 2010. The incremental rates have put in incremental base rate, incremental reliability cost adjustment, the capped renewable portfolio standard energy adjustment. So that's for directly and indirectly owned renewable projects. So stuff that we own on balance sheet as well as something we own through SCAPA. And then the variable RPS, that is for anything we buy from the market, more on short-term purchases or PPAs. And then the variable energy adjustment, which is really the fuel cost, natural gas. It's obviously very complicated when we have a utility our size, 3.5 billion different plants that are in different locations and different things that have happened. Again, anywhere you go in this area, driving to Vegas, you're seeing our transmission lines over. You drive to Phoenix, when you get a little west of Phoenix, you'll look to the right, that's Palo Verde Nuclear Power Plant. We have a portion of that as well. Virtually everywhere you look when you drive around is DWP has assets, including Hoover Dam as well.
So this is, it's very complex within each of these categories, but this is what makes up the rates.
This is what makes up the rates.
How analogous is this to what other utilities have? I imagine that because of the transparency at the PUC, when rate cases go through, we could effectively benchmark what goes into somebody else's rates and how we structure ours. How different are we from? And I understand it's a difficult question because we're a very, as you said, big and diverse system. But as it relates to a cap, non-cap, variable sort of layers of costs that go into the rate cases, how similar are we to other utilities?
So let me answer, and maybe I'll have Dr. Pickle knows more about the other utilities, but let me just make a couple of points. One is, when you see this is the structure we have. What our customers see, they do not see all this. They just see what the charge is for each one of those.
Sure.
So they say it's the combination of the cap plus the incremental, because we're trying to make it easier for our customers.
It might be beneficial because they'll understand why it's so complex.
Yeah.
But I hear your point. These surcharges, though, are they similar to other utility rate making?
The broadcast, there is one major difference. The investor-owned utilities reviewed by the PUC are not subject to 218 and 26, so they don't have the incremental structure. That doubles the complexity of what we have here. But if you look at the base rate and the fuel cost component, in addition to the base rate and fuel cost component and purchase power cost component, which are common to nearly all the utilities, at the PUC there are a great number of other adjustment factors.
And is that the only place where we could, I'm going to use the term benchmark, our rate making? Other municipal utilities, they don't have would we have access to this sort of level of transparency to to see what it is that they do versus what we do?
It's actually harder to get information from other municipal utilities. Back to the benchmarking effort, they don't have to file a FERC Form 1, which
Right.
gives us a lot of data. Their rates certainly have a lot of these same components, but as far as past the rates, it's very difficult to get information from municipal utilities because they just don't have to file that. I mean, you could find it through each of the different regulatory bodies such as yourself, but it's not, with the investor-owned utilities, it's much easier to get that information. One thing, I think we mentioned this earlier, that variable energy adjustment, because of the natural gas prices dropping, that has actually caused our rates to go down 1.5% this fiscal year, which is something, that again is the benefit to our customer. You don't hear about in the press, but our rates have dropped this year.
Sure, but conversely, if there's a problem with supply, let's say
Yep.
Aliso Canyon,
Right.
and we have to wheel more gas to the system, that potentially is going to cost a lot more.
It's all right. It's all up to the market, and that's the reason why you want it as a pass-through. So now this is on the residential side. You can't really read the numbers on the bottom, but I'll talk a little bit about them. My staff always puts this in the proper cardinal and gold. I apologize for all the Bruins.
Just one strike against
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Koretz, myself, and Mr. Blumenfield all are sons of Westwood for the record.
I got no love anywhere, huh? Okay. All right, Neil, why don't you take over? So we have two different zones, and when we get to the water, you'll see that we have three different zones. But this is set up on the budget, what a customer needs, and we did a lot of study in this when this was implemented in 2008. But you can see here, Tier 1, which is the lowest cost. So Zone 1 in the cooler area, in the yellow area, they get that price for up to 350 kilowatt hours. Zone 2, which is in the warmer area, and again, we did studies on this, gets the same price but up to 500 kilowatt hours. And then they get double of that, so you get another 700 kilowatt hours. Here gets up to 1050. Anything above that, which is in Tier 2, then anything above that will be in Tier 3. And same thing on Tier 2 and the Zone 2 and above 1500. What's interesting on this, and again, you can't really see it in the charts. We should have made it bigger. But when you look at this, the warmer areas actually use less of the Tier 3 and less of the Tier 2 as a percentage basis. And that's something that most people it's counterintuitive, but that you really see a lot more consumption at the higher areas in the cooler areas. So it may be something that's not, when you look at the power budget is based on the science, what you need with the principal requirements for it coming from refrigeration and lighting and all that, but you're using more power actually in the cooler areas.
Is this weighted, or is this sort of the raw number?
It's the percentage of the total amount for that area.
Okay.
Could you explain that? That doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, so when I look here, let's take the warmer area. In Tier 1 for the warmer area, and again, you can't see it. I can barely see it here. It's 36% of the total consumption for all the electricity consumed in the red area is at Tier 1 pricing. And then in the second one, it's 56% of the total energy consumed in the red area is at Tier 2, and then at Tier 3, it's I think it's about 8.9% of the total consumption is in that area. So we can provide you the graphs, that have it's easier to read. But the bottom line is when we look at average rate for residential, warm area versus the cool, it's almost identical. So it tells us a little bit that our range. Yeah, and again, that's because the Zone 2 has higher allotment, so it uses it.
So you're using more energy in the hot areas. You're just you just have a little bit more bandwidth.
Actually, on a per customer basis, you will use a little bit more in the warm area overall, but the really big consumers that have the high usage, and this is both water and power, are really more in this area on the west side.
Are you talking about residential or? are you
Residential
talking
only, that's all I'm talking about, is residential in this.
That the big users,
Are, you know, like we've said in the top 4 users of Tier 4 water, but it's the same really on power. All of them are in the cooler zone, the coolest zone, which we'll get to on the water, with the one exception, the medium zone, which is 90210. So part of it is, it may not be exactly associated with the air conditioning note. We know, especially in your district council member, because it's so warm, they will use it. But when you compare it on a system-wide basis, much of the energy consumption and water consumption is driven by other factors other than temperature. But that's why we think the water allotment method and the power allotment method works, because it says this is how much water and power you should use for your area or for your house. And we have other things, again, you know, doing this at a high level, but it's temperature zone, it's lots, on water side, it's lot size, it's the time of the year, and on the power, you know, we're basically doing this just on the amount of power needed in each of the areas. And we know in the valley, if it's 10, 15 degrees warmer, your refrigerator is going to work harder, and that's why you get the 150 kilowatt hours more.
But is there more conservation? Is that, I mean, so on the yellow side here, there's more use.
Right.
There's other factors like you say, but there's more conservation in the red side here.
There's conservation everywhere. There's just less usage at the higher tiers on the red side.
And so I would attribute that to conservation. I mean, you know, a whole house fan versus air conditioning. I mean,
Right.
I think that's plays into it. But
Right.
it makes sense to me. I just don't understand why it doesn't make sense to you.
well,
Because you run your AC more. I mean, that's the thing, right? And I don't. So I think that's
And one thing, you know, again, on a residential side, there's 3 big things, one of which was addressed today. You know, air conditioning is going to cause a lot of energy consumption. Pool pumps cause a lot of energy consumption. Most people don't think about that. We've got a big rebate right now, $1,000 on roughly a 1,500 installation. You can save about 15% overall. We've got that in our energy efficiency as well. And then multiple refrigerators, which tend to have adult beverages in the garage where it's 110 degrees, also take a lot of energy as well.
that's why you'd expect the red zone to be using more energy. No, the pool pumps and everything else, yeah. And adult beverages, but.
No, but I mean, I think the point is that I think that we have a very good story to tell about conservation, and my sense is that there's more conservation going on in the hotter areas, and it'd be interesting to sort of verify that. So are rebates flowing more in that part of town for the
Right.
pool pumps, the whole house fan, the energy efficiency washer and dryers, all the things that I've availed myself of? Is there more activity in these areas?
Right, and we'll look at, one other thing, just when we look at those cooler areas that I was pointing to, they don't tend to vary as much with temperature. So in other words, they'll have high consumption that they'll have all year long. Whereas, you know, out in the warmer areas, that tends to vary a lot with temperature. You know, in the warmer days, everybody runs their air conditioner, but they're not running it, you know, in the north and the cooler for this time of year, obviously. But in the other areas, they seem to be relatively indifferent to what the temperature is.
Mr. Chair, I suspect it may be a little different. I mostly represent the orange areas. I think it may be a little more abuse by some than lack of conservation. I mean, we have a lot of very large homes. If you have a home with 10 bedrooms and a 3-acre property, you may have been watering, 3 acres of grass unnecessarily and running a lot of air conditioning unnecessarily and having the wealth to not care. So that's clearly something we've been trying to crack down on the water side. Probably something we need to try and crack down more on the power side as well.
So part of what I'll get to on the water as well, but on all of these, it has to be cost-based. So we have to make sure that the tiers and what we do on each one of these is Tier 3, people that are consuming more energy, they have to pay for the higher prices of power. Same thing on the water, and I'll show you what we mean by that. But it is going to have higher tier pricing, the top tier on the water side, which I'll get to in a minute.
But I hesitate to have us just base something, say, on a lot size, because
Right.
we have some properties where the lot is gigantic,
Gigantic, right.
but it's not a golf course, and even golf courses are cutting back and finding the areas that don't really need to be green and wiping them out.
Right.
We should be doing much more of that on, 2-3 acre properties where it's really not necessary to have a blade of grass on every possible space.
Right. So let me continue, and we'll get to the water. I'm not going to go in this in detail, but the key commercial rate components, we have a monthly fixed service charge, which is primarily to recover the meter reading, billing, and other associated costs. The facilities charge, you may get that question from your commercial customers. That is intended to, it looks at the last 12 months and what the highest recorded peak demand was. And that is intended to recover the distribution costs from those customers. The demand charges we talked about earlier, that is to recover the capacity charge for generation and transmission essentially, and then the energy charge is just how much fuel burn essentially coming from the generation plants. One thing just to talk about, and we'll get into this in more detail, but it's just our low-income and lifeline programs that we have. So the median residential bill, and this is at the 400 kilowatt hour, is about $61. When you look at the typical low-income customer, they actually consume less energy, as you'd expect. And they're down at 300 kilowatt hours, and they get a credit of about $8.17 per month. And so when they get that, they're paying $32.50, so almost half of what you see on the typical residential. And then Lifeline gets even a further credit of roughly $17.71, and their bill typically, again, at 300 kilowatt hours, is a little under $23. So part of what we're looking at our most vulnerable customers, we want to ensure they're protected, and I think this shows that we've done that, as well as when we look at the pricing that you're going to see in the new rate proposal, the lowest tier is driven by those lower costs.
And so I just have to ask, I mean, I've wondered about this. I understand why we would want to do it, and I think it's great that we've done it. And there is, at least with telecommunications, I think there's state legislation that allows us to do it. But how do we, with Prop 26 and 218, how do we do that here?
Again, this probably is a conversation we probably want to have in
Okay.
closed session.
All right, thought so. All right.
Richard?
Yes.
I think I can safely add that these provisions are included in the grandfathered section of the rates.
Say that again, Fred, because that's
The
important.
lifeline and low-income
Low-income.
provisions are included in the grandfathered portion of the rates.
The pre-2010 rate.
Pre-2010.
No, I understand, but there are additional factors that are going to go into future rate cases, and that's above.
But none of the subsidies.
Okay, got it. All right.
And a question we have for exploration as we move forward is, can any of these be indexed under the Prop 26 fairness standard?
So now we'll move to water. Again, very similar. If you look at page 18, the water system is basically made up from the water sources. So we can get water from the State Water Project, the western slope of the Sierras. We have the LA Aqueduct. Our cheapest water that we get is from the eastern slope of the Sierras, from essentially Mammoth Mountain on down. And that's what you see coming down when you're driving by Newhall Pass. You'll see the big cascade. That's actually the second aqueduct, which is about half the capacity of the first one, which is to the bottom left of that, which is where William Mulholland made the famous statement, and you see some of the pictures. That goes from in the water there, it goes to our filtration plant, where most of the water is filtered. The ozone, which I spent a number of years of my life constructing in earlier days, the filtration and UV, but it produces the treated water out of that. And you also have stormwater and groundwater coming out, and that's in pumps that are in the San Fernando Valley as well that come in. And all that water goes down through trunk lines. We also have the capability of getting treated water from the Colorado. So again, western slopes of the Sierra, eastern slopes of the Sierra, Colorado River Basin. It's something most people just don't realize how far reaching LA Water and Power is on both water and power. We have pump stations, which, if Marty's still here, when you look at our system, we use a lot less pumps than most systems because of what everybody did in the early 1900s and designing it by gravity. It's just, from an engineering point of view, it's a great system. And then eventually you get down through the main lines, and we got 7,200 miles of that, obviously providing fire service, and it gets to our customers there. So you have water source, treatment, the distribution system, and then it gets to the customer costs. So similar to what we saw on the power side, this is our revenue requirement. And the O&M and labor is 27%, so a little bit higher just by function of the purchase water costs is still 15%. This is 15-16 that we're looking at here, so it's 15%. This varies quite a bit depending on what the snowpack is. We're obviously hopeful for a good year this year. We're off to a mildly good start, but we'd like it to be better because it lowers the cost through our pass-through. We have cash funding and capital programs, 24%. Principal and interest costs, this is again 24%. That is our debt service cost right there. And then O&M materials, which is essentially chemicals and repairs that we have to make. But that gets us our revenue requirement. So similar to power, it identifies how much money we need to collect from our customers. And I won't go through in detail, but when you look at this, major programs, the same thing when you look at how much we can collect from the current rates. We can't collect that money, and that's why we need this difference right here is the rate increase that we need to increase our revenues to be able to do all the things. And again, this is purely financial. We're not looking at the programs, which is another cut, which I think you'll see in another couple of weeks where we break this out and look on the programs that are driving these costs. So the legal guidance here, we've had some discussion about it. The city charter, section 609, where the board is obligated to establish water rates sufficient to cover debt service and necessary operating expenses to maintain the system. And we're including the accelerated availability of local water sources. That's a big thing that we're doing. With this drought, if we had our local water sources where we're collecting, the city of Los Angeles, 460 square miles, when the rain falls, we all see it go through the LA River and out. Part of what the water system is working hard on is to try to develop those local water sources, which ultimately will save our customers money in the future. And then Prop 218, just the first bullet is really the key. Revenues derived from the water fee shall not exceed the funds to provide the service. And the third bullet, the amount of the fee imposed on any parcel or person shall not exceed the proportional cost of service attributable to that parcel. So legalese for their rates have to be in line with their costs to serve them are.
And so on that point, the San Juan Capistrano case hinges on that interpretation.
Right.
That's correct. And I think that that case has not been appealed, so we will, at this point, it is guidance. It's not necessarily the only word on it, and I think districts like ours are in the middle of determining how exactly San Juan Capistrano fits into how we do these kinds of rates, tiers, and such.
But going forward, because it hasn't been appealed yet, there isn't a statutory limit on how soon or how long before somebody does appeal. I mean, it feels good that it hasn't been appealed. We're working on our rate structure based on the fact that it hasn't been appealed, but it's still there's an uncertainty out there.
That's correct. Well, and I should note that we have 2 lawsuits pending against the city challenging the tiered rate structure. So similar to my admonition previous, I think we have to be cautious in discussion of this because we don't want to be in a mode where we have discussion that adversely impacts those pending lawsuits because they do challenge tiering across the board. They believe the lawsuits contend that all tiering of rates is...
So for those keeping score at home, 3 lawsuits on the transfer, 2 on the tiers.
That's correct.
Okay, that we've covered in this meeting so far.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we aren't even covering the billing class actions or other lawsuits. So yes, we are in the middle of being sued across the board.
Well, you'd be off topic, sir, if we talked about that.
I apologize.
All right.
Remember, part of our increased cost is attorney fees. So on the next page, on page 22, and you asked questions about San Juan Capistrano. So what what this shows is our method that we have for the upcoming rate action and how we've structured it. So if you look on the left-hand side, this is water uses. And so Tier 1 is 68% of the total. That's the basic use 8 HCF that each customer gets, which is for indoor use. Really the most important is for indoor use, for human consumption, for all the normal things you do within your home. The next is Tier 2 is the efficient California drought tolerant. That's about 20% of the total. And then if somebody under the current restrictions can use for a lawn, that's the high use. That's about 8% of the total. And then above that is the excessive use, which 4% of the total is that use for the high use, the higher use. So that's how much water is used by all of our customers. So what this means is if we had every customer in the city of LA had their basic use and did California drought tolerant landscape and they watered it exactly the amount, we would be at roughly 88% of our total consumption. What you see on the right-hand side is our supply. So what we have in the ordinance that will be coming to you is it's actually a dynamic system where we look forward and we say, what is our cost of supply? And I just put typical amounts. So LA Aqueduct, on a typical year, we get roughly 53% of our water comes from there. You can see the typical cost for that is 55 cents an HCF. That's very low-cost water. The next is groundwater pumping, 18%, is roughly $1.33. And then MWD water, which is our purchase water, that's $2.64. And then the top is recycled water. And this changes quite a bit depending on when you look at it, is roughly $3.60. So when we set what the pricing is, again, consistent with the San Juan Capistrano case, you can see if this is 68% for Tier 1, that's going to get all the LA Aqueduct water, right? And then you're going to have another 15% of the groundwater. So you figure out what that cost is, and for the water supply portion of that rate, that's what they're going to get based on that. And we look at this every 6 months. We're going to look at what those pricings are going forward, how much the volumes are. For example, if the Godzilla El Nino actually occurs, and this LA Aqueduct, we get a lot of water, well, it's going to drive, it'll go up higher here, so it'll lower the amount of MWD, so it will lower the cost for our customers as well. But we're always looking at the prioritized use of the water. So it's something we did a lot of work over a number of months with. I got to know Richard incredibly well because he spent a lot of time on the 4th floor in the JFB.
So it's very, I was going to use the word fluid, but it's very variable how this works. In this, well, first things first. The right graph does not correspond with the left graph. That's not intended to say that up until Tier 2 we're using LA. That's not the loading order of water.
On the right side?
Yeah, on the right side.
Yeah, the right side actually is because it's got the lowest cost of the water.
So LA Aqueduct covers all the way up through Tier 2.
It covers, so the LA Aqueduct covers 53%, which is not all of Tier 1 because Tier 1 is 68%.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, right, so the colors.
Yeah.
Color, right, okay, got it. The colors match, not the
Right.
height.
I
Okay,
couldn't get it to scale. We were looking, I mean, so it's
It's
just.
a very nice graph.
Yeah.
But
So,
the point,
So on the water side of things, oh gosh, I'm losing my point here. All right, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, so
loading.
anyway, that's, and I'll get to how we structure our rates, but this is just the water supply piece. That's the main variable that we have. When we say Tier 1 versus Tier 4, it's based because Tier 4 is coming from the recycled water. You can see in this case it actually matches exactly. The top tier, the top priced water is for the top 4%, which is recycled water, which is driving the price of Tier 4
I
water.
remember my point. So this layer in the rate, it's variable. You're looking at it every 6 months.
Right.
Is it, as drafted in the proposed ordinance and sort of today, I don't know if it's the same, that sort of variability, does it pass through naturally in the bills to folks, or is this sort of locked in?
No, they'll see it, again, as every 6 months, that will be a pass-through that'll hit our customers based on what the conditions
So it's
are.
not rigid. I mean, it's
No.
it's designed to be able to
Right.
sort of pass through.
Right.
Okay.
You could
depending
actually
on-
have, if for some reason the LA Aqueduct had very low production and its cost was higher, you could have groundwater pumping as the lowest. It's just we always structure the lowest cost water first, and that goes to the lower tiers.
Got it. Okay.
Is that on the overall bill, or you're saying it's just on the marginal bill above the?
No, on the water side, we don't have any of the rates. It'll just be right on the bill itself.
And is there anyone trying to get us to do all of that as one water supply as opposed to doing it the way we're doing it?
No, well, again, this is the new way we're going to do it with the new rates that we're proposing that will be coming to you shortly.
It's also the legal way.
Yeah.
We believe that the way we've done it is appropriate. Councilmember Blumenfeld, to your question, for those folks who believe that no tiers are appropriate or believe that one rate should be charged for all water use, there are folks who would argue there should just be the same rate regardless of tier, there should be no tiers. It should just all be the same usage. Whether you use 1 HCF or 1,000 HCF, it should be the same rate. There are people who argue that.
Right. And on the flip side, there's also people who are going to argue that tier 4 should be a conservation goal rather than related to the water supply goal, and we should just be setting that independent of it. But by setting it dependent of it, it makes it more related to our actual cost.
Actual cost.
That's correct.
Mr. Kretz?
I know we've talked about this before. Are we still looking at a tier 5 in essence, which is an illegal use at which we would fine the user for using above an amount that we set?
I think it's, Marty.
Hey, Marty.
Marty Adams. We're instead of a tier 5, because these tiers are based on, what the water costs us to deliver, and we wanted to make sure that we allocated all the costs because we did want to send a strong conservation message.
Right, and obviously tier 5 is a joke.
We're addressing
Fine,
that concern in the revised water conservation ordinance, where there will be fines and penalties for excessive water use outside of the actual rate structure, because we couldn't really justify another tier in the rate structure because it has to be cost-based, but we have the ability to set up a fine and penalty structure based on, unreasonable water use independent of the rates themselves.
So we are looking at that.
Absolutely, yes.
Great, thank you.
Or we could just buy some water from San Diego, some desal water, probably would be.
It'd be very expensive, yes. That would put it up there in price, yes.
How much are they paying for their water?
The Santa Barbara has, I think, a 39% rate increase because they're opening their desal plant. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. So this is the same chart, but now this is the water side. I just won't get into all the tiers because, again, it's just too small. But you see the 3 different temperature zones. So the blue is really the coolest zone. Again, this is to the school that I should have paid attention to before coming here, the blue and gold. The gold is the medium zone, and then the red is the hottest zone. So for the water, it has 3 different zones. Again, what you see and is the consumption. The cooler zones actually consume the most on a percentage basis of the tier 4 when we're looking at those projections. And then this is the structure of our water rates. So our water rates are going to be very consistent across the way with our different, the base rate here. This is the base rate revenue target adjustment, so that's whatever comes in from the decoupling. Water expense stabilization adjustment, that's essentially to fund our earthquake fund. So if we have an earthquake, we need to make sure we have sufficient cash to drive up for costs and all those different things. We're looking at that as we move forward. Water infrastructure reliability, low income subsidy adjustment, Owens Valley regulatory adjustment, water quality improvement adjustment, and then this is the water supply cost, which we just had on the previous slide. So you can see each tier gets higher and higher. And the one other thing that the water system has looked at from an engineering perspective is peak pumping and storage. There's some additional costs that we put in the base rate, but that's how we drive our tier pricing. So it's based on costs, which we believe to be, as Richard talked about, very consistent with the San Juan case. And then the water residential bill, and this is out in 1920, so this is at the end of the rate action. We're looking at our typical residential, and again, you see 10 HCF, that's part of the conservation. Our typical right now is about 12, but will be about $53. And then the typical low income is going to be $34, and they get about a $5 per month subsidy, and that gets the rate down to that lower amount. But they're consuming in general 8 HCF. They consume less. That's something you'll see on both the low income and Lifeline. And the Lifeline's about a $10 per month. You can see is a little under $30.
Is this on a monthly or the bi-monthly?
It's on a monthly basis. We
This
did
graph?
that, yeah.
Okay.
And with that, that's the conclusion of Rates 101.
Mr. Chair, a question on the Lifeline. By 2020, the difference between low income and Lifeline is almost non-existent. And presumably, if we go further out, they could almost even pass each other. Why is that, and does it make sense to even continue the extra work and complications of a Lifeline if there's not much savings for the Lifeline customers?
I believe that because of some of the issues relative to those programs, we probably should have that discussion in closed session.
Okay, well, if we can remember to raise that issue in closed session, that would be good.
You can count on me, Mr. Koretz. All right. Colleagues, any additional comments or questions? I think this is a very good primer. I can't wait to do this again for the full city council. I think this is going to be very informative as we talk about rates and the future of our customers. Gentlemen and audience, thank you for your patience. This is a very exciting issue area for us. And if there are no further questions, Madam Clerk, we'll go ahead and receive and file this, and we'll save our council colleagues the presentation and tell them all about it. Thank you all very much. There are no public comment cards, and so seeing no additional questions, we are adjourned.